So let's get right into our program today. So at Dyslexia Canada, we get numerous questions on this topic from right across the country. I'd first like to start by saying that the disability tax credit isn't for everyone. It's extremely fact specific, and the standard and the eligibility criteria is set quite high. However, because dyslexia and its impacts are still very misunderstood in Canada, it's important for families to understand what the eligibility criteria is, how you go about applying for it, and what some of the benefits of applying for it are, so you can make your own determination whether you want to proceed with applying or not. It's also important for you to understand what the eligibility criteria is, so when you go to your medical professional, who will ultimately be filling out the application, asks questions, you can help prepare. So today, we intend to go through a few things. First, we're going to look at the disability tax credit in general. Who is eligible? What's the process look like? Working with your medical professional, and how to prepare for that meeting. Then we're going to look at one of the main benefits of the disability tax credit, and that is the RDSP, or the Registered Disability Savings Plan. And we'll look at beneficiaries, holders, grants, bonds, and withdrawals. And then, as I said, we will leave time for questions and answers. So with that, I would like to now introduce our speakers, Cynthia and Sarah. So first, Cynthia works as Program Manager and Outreach Coordinator at Disability Alliance BC's Access RDSP program in partnership with Plan Institute and the BC Aboriginal Network on Disability Society. She holds an MA in English Literature from the University of British Columbia, and she sits on the Board of Directors for Plan Institute and is a member of the Disability Tax Fairness Alliance. And we have Sarah. Sarah is Director, Tax and Estate Planning at IG Wealth Management. She provides advice on personal tax and estate planning issues, including planning for beneficiaries with disabilities and blended families. She's an expert on various registered plans, including RRSPs, RESPs, and RDSPs. Sarah has a Certified Financial Planner designation and is a member of the Law Society of Manitoba. And we are very proud to have Sarah here representing IG today as Dyslexia Canada's founding partner. So with that, I'd like to hand over the presentation to Cynthia to start us off.
Thank you so much, Christine. Hi, everyone. My name is Cynthia, and I manage the program Access RDSP. As Christine mentioned, this program is in partnership with other organizations, Plan Institute and the BC Aboriginal Network on Disability Society. And together we want to be a one-stop shop to help boost RDSP uptake. We offer free Canada-wide support. So any questions that you have about the DTC and RDSP, you'll see our contact information at the end of my section, and you can get in touch with us. If you're also in BC, at Disability Alliance BC, we provide free one-to-one support to help everyone with disabilities access federal and provincial disability benefits. So again, if you'd like to get in touch with us, you can do so. But let's begin. So what is the disability tax credit? Well, it reduces the amount of taxes you need to pay, or it can help one of your family members. So the nice thing about it is if you don't owe any taxes, or your child will not owe any taxes, it can actually be transferred to eligible family members or caregivers. The DTC is the way the federal government, kind of measures who has a disability at this time. So it does also help you access other benefits. One example being a disability top-up for the Canada's Workers Benefit, and another one is a disability top-up for anyone who has a child with a disability and is receiving the child tax benefit, they would receive the child disability benefit. We'll discuss this a little bit later, but it's the qualifying factor to opening a registered disability savings plan. And the nice thing about it is that you can claim up to 10 previous years. So if you or your child have been living with their disability for 10 years, you can go back and claim that full amount. But it's nice to know that it's a separate application process from other federal benefits like CPPD and also provincial disability benefits. Here in BC, we have the PWD benefit, and other provinces have different provincial disability benefits, and they're all separate. So how would you be eligible? Well, to become eligible, a qualified medical practitioner has to certify that you have a severe and prolonged impairment in mental or physical functions. What's a prolonged impairment? It means that your disability has lasted at least 12 months. And what's a severe impairment? It means that you may be restricted, very restricted, in one basic activity of the following categories: vision, speaking, feeding and preparing food, hearing, walking, toileting, dressing, or mental functions necessary for everyday life. Or you might find that you're not very restricted, but you're somewhat restricted in 2 or more of the above activities. Or you might find that you require life-sustaining therapy for a vital function, at least 3 times a week for an average of 14 hours a week. So how do you apply? Well, you can get your DTC form online, and we provided the link right there. What you do is you fill out Part A, which is the first page of the application. You can do that, or you can find help from a support person. And then you take the rest of the form to another qualified health professional who's going to help you fill out and certify the impact of your child's restriction. When you're going to a medical professional, a lot of people don't know this, but it's not just your doctor that can help you. Doctors can can help you fill out the application if you qualify for physical and mental functionings. They can certify all sections, and nurse practitioners can do the same. But let's say you have specific impairments. You can go to other professionals, an optometrist, audiologist, in your case, maybe speech language pathologist or a psychologist. So keep in mind your restrictions and who you might want to go to. So when you're thinking about dyslexia, you know, one of the biggest restrictions you might find your child might have is in the category of mental functioning. When you're thinking about this, you want to look at different categories. Remember that for this application, it's not based on diagnosis, but rather on functionality. So you want to look at different, your child's functionality in different areas, such as self-care. Are they able to maintain personal hygiene without assistance? Health and safety needs, basic social interactions, simple transactions, memory or cognitive functioning, problem solving, goal setting, and judgment. And whenever someone needs assistance or things like that, that's when you want to pay special attention to thinking about how someone might be restricted in that area. And what does 90% mean? Well, you might think that, you know, this person has to be impaired all the time, but when we're thinking about things like mental functioning, we also want to stress that you don't necessarily need to display symptoms 90% of the time. We've seen applicants get approved if they have recurring symptoms, episodic symptoms, but that these, the propensity to have symptoms displayed a lot kind of makes up that 90%. So that's something to keep in mind. So when choosing a medical practitioner, you want to think about your challenges your child faces in daily living. So it could be in learning, it could be in communication, or it could be in mental health. So if it's in communication, you might want to look at a speech language pathologist. If it's in mental health and there are comorbid conditions, you might want to look at your psychologist. You want to choose a medical practitioner that knows you and your child's health and can describe the functional impact in your daily life. There's no preferred medical practitioner, so choose the one that you think will be the most beneficial for this application. You don't need to ask the person who diagnosed your child's disability. And remember, as mentioned before, eligibility is not based on diagnosis, but rather on restrictions in the areas that we mentioned. One thing to keep in mind is you might want to ask the medical practitioner if they will charge a fee for completing the form. If you do get charged for it, you can actually claim the form as a medical expense when you file your taxes. So when you're choosing, you want to consider which restriction is most dominant or impactful. And remember that it's the CRA and not the medical practitioner that determines eligibility. And so if you want to try it out. Try out an application. How can you prepare? Well, let's say you have several medical professionals that can help you with the form, but you want your psychologist to help you. Well, what you can do if your psychologist doesn't have all the information is sort of share reports between medical professionals. So if you have a speech language pathologist that can speak more to the language-based restrictions, then you want to be able to for the speech language pathologist can actually write a letter or share any report that they have to your psychologist, and that can help your psychologist fill out the application. But it's a good thing to keep in mind that you want to keep copies of all these reports and all the things that are transferred in case the CRA has any questions. You can bring a support person to medical appointments if needed. A lot of the times, you may need help to understand certain aspects of the form, to fill out certain aspects. So remember that a support person is a great thing to have. And you want to prepare by having as many examples and painting a complete picture of the restrictions in your child's daily life. So draft examples of these challenges. Remember when you're drafting examples to compare your child to kids that are the same age as a child. Think about length of time. How long does it take for them to complete an activity? Are there different functionality things that happen in different settings, in home, school, playground? And think about frequency. How often does your child have these restrictions? Is it 90% of the time? Is it very often? Think about that, keep that in mind, jot it down in a journal. Here are some examples that you might think of. So Kayvon is unable to remember and complete a task which has more than 2 steps. He needs to be reminded after each step what the next one is. It takes him 3 times longer to complete a multi-step task than it does other children his age. So when you're thinking of this example, this might show, some restrictions in some of the categories, but you want to paint a holistic picture. So think about all the categories in self-care, social interaction, and things like that. So as you can see, for this, it's impairment in cognitive function, difficulty multitasking. Those are some things that you can use. Husan is unable to remember left and right and gets directions confused. In addition, he cannot decode street signs fast enough or accurately enough to travel safely. It takes him longer to prepare to go places, determine the bus routes, and longer to travel to new places so he does not get lost. So being direction poor can be restrictive in your daily life. So that could be an example that you want to use in your application. What about Kate? So Kate's limited in reading and writing ability has impacted her confidence. self-esteem, and mental well-being. She exhibits signs of depression and anxiety in the classroom and at home. She cries almost every night, does not sleep, and is exhausted every day. It takes her 3 times longer than other children to complete everyday tasks such as dressing, washing, and eating. She is no longer able to leave the house to go to school regularly. On the days she does go, she frequently has a panic attack and must leave the classroom. So this example really illustrates sometimes where individuals are living with dyslexia might also be living with other conditions, other comorbid conditions. And you want to, again, think about how all of these conditions at once are impacting functionality. So this dyslexia in Kate's case has made her more anxious at home and the classroom, and that's impacted her ability to perform basic activities. So that's a great example. And what about Nadia? So Nadia is unable to read. She cannot complete government forms or applications on her own. Examples, CERB, OSAP, a driver's license renewal, or a passport application. She must have a family member sit with her, read it, and write in the answers for her. Even with the support, completing forms takes an inordinate amount of time compared to other people. Nadia is a teenager, so her social life is largely text-based. Her reading challenges impact the length of time it takes her to make plans and communicate with her friends on a daily basis. So this is a good example, and it shows that, you know, simple daily things that she needs to get done, she needs assistance for, and even with assistance, it still takes her a lengthy amount of time. And you can see how it impacts memory, concentration, but also social interaction. So these are just some examples you might consider, but we want to emphasize that, you know, these examples aren't guaranteed. You want to put as many examples as you can into your application, but we want to remind you that the CRA is the institution that sort of decides whether or not your child is eligible. So try it out, but you know, it's not necessarily a guarantee. What can you do to strengthen your application? Well, you want to use key phrases. You want to think about frequency, as we said. So does your restriction happen substantially all the time, or at least 90% of the time? Remember that 90% of the time doesn't necessarily mean that your symptoms have to be present 90% of the time, but that someone is restricted 90% of the time. So episodic or recurring things are also can be considered. You want to say that you want to think about whether someone needs help with an activity all the time, or whether they're unable to manage an activity independently all the time. If it's a restriction that's a marked restriction, you want to use phrases like severely restricted. When you're thinking about the length of time it takes, you want to measure it out. So with a marked restriction, it should take someone 3 times as long as someone else without their restriction compared to someone their age. If it's a significant restriction and they have comorbid conditions that together can qualify under the cumulative effects category, then they should take at least 2 times as long compared to an average person their age to complete a daily activity. There are phrases not to include. So when you're writing this application, do not include academic skills. And I know that's difficult because we see dyslexia impact functionality a lot at school in reading and writing, you know, academic skills. But unfortunately, this is irrelevant to the application. We really want to tease out how symptoms can impact daily living and other basic activities. Also, you don't want to include things like the ability to work, to housekeep, to manage a bank account, to drive, or engage in recreational activities. These are all not relevant to qualifying. And we've seen denials. It might not mean that the child is not eligible. It might mean that, you know, the form was filled out incorrectly and these things were mentioned. So just be very careful of what your doctor and or medical professional includes in the application. So you've submitted your application. What happens next? How do you know when you're approved? It may take a while. It may take 3 to 4 months for the CRA to make a decision, and they're going to inform you via letter or on your My Account. You can call them you can call the CRA to check on your application if you haven't heard back. What are some responses? Well, the CRA has more questions. They may send an additional questionnaire to your medical practitioner. So check in with your medical practitioner if you haven't heard back in a while and see if that has happened. Or you may be approved. A lot of times we see, even with people with permanent disabilities, that you may only be approved for a number of years. An example might be an approval for 5 years or 1 year. Some people do get approval for future years, an indeterminate approval, and that means that you don't have to reapply unless the CRA asks, but it is very varied, so everyone gets different responses. Or you may be declined. We want to say that if you're declined, that's not the end of the road. You have options. You can either send in more medical information with your medical practitioner, or you can submit a formal objection to the appeal center. And if you feel like you have done all those steps and you're still denied, you can also submit a formal objection to the tax court. Again, so if you need any help during this process, someone to check over your application, someone to talk about, where to shop for Registered Disabilities Savings Plans in different financial institutions, what to consider when opening and managing one, or if you need help with the DTC application itself, you can contact us. We offer free support. It's a Canada-wide helpline that I put up there. You can contact that, email, and website. And that's it for me.
Perfect. Thank you, Cynthia. That's extremely useful information, helpful information. And one of the things that we get asked at all the time is, if I'm denied, will I know why? Are you?
Yes. Yeah, so usually when they send you a letter of denial, they'll tell you the reason why. It can be in very generic wording, so it might be something like you don't qualify because you're not meeting the eligible criteria for this thing, and that can be very vague. That might mean that they need more medical information, but it can be also very specific. So sometimes, it can be that, you want to apply for 10 years previous, but your doctor has just said that they have medical records from 2019 onwards, and so they can only approve you for that time. They're very specific in the reason they tell you, and the vagueness comes in with their wording. So if you ever need any advice with that, take it to an advocate, and they can help you decipher why by looking at your original application, what was sent in, and what you can do, what your options are.
Perfect. Thank you. And I have been scrolling through the questions, and there is actually one question there that I will answer right now. A question came up whether dyslexia is the same thing as a specific learning disability or a learning disability. On behalf of Dyslexia Canada, I would like to say we do encourage and we promote the use of the word dyslexia, because we strongly feel that's the only way that we will make an impact and start to raise awareness and break down some of those misconceptions. However, you might want to consider, when you're filling out this application, putting in the language that the government uses. So using specific learning disability or learning disability might help strengthen your report. It's hard for me to say that at Dyslexia Canada, as I would like to say, and tell everyone that you should be using dyslexia, but yes, it is the same thing. Perfect. So with that, I am going to hand over the controls here to Sarah, and Sarah is going to walk us through at a high level the RDSP.
Thanks, Christine. And thank you for inviting me to the session. I'm very happy to participate. Today, what I'm going to talk about is just a very high level review of RDSPs, in particular RDSP beneficiaries and holders and the eligibility requirements for those, how grants and bonds work, and very briefly how withdrawals work. But again, this is a very high level. There are a lot of nuances to RDSPs. So, you know, you'll probably want to talk to your financial advisor about specific questions. So what is an RDSP? Again, at a high level, it is a long-term savings plan for a person with disabilities that provides assisted savings, by which I mean the government will kick in some money, and tax-deferred investment growth. So how do they work? Well, essentially, you start by putting in contributions to the plan, and the government will then match those contributions, and sometimes more than match them, by way of government grants. And sometimes, depending on family income, you may also be eligible for the government bonds. All that money will just sit in a plan and grow on a tax-deferred basis as time goes by until you're ready to start making withdrawals, which are payable to the beneficiary. Withdrawals in the RDSP world, they're referred to as disability assistance payments, or DAPs, but I call them withdrawals because that's just plain English. So who's who in an RDSP? There's two parties. You have the beneficiary, who is the person with disabilities who's going to benefit from the plan. And oops, sorry, I don't know how that happened. Go back. Okay, funny things happen. Okay, so you have the beneficiary, who is the person with disabilities on whose behalf the plan was made. And also, you can only have one beneficiary per plan and one plan per beneficiary. So any given person, if they have a plan already, that's their only plan. And then you have the holder, and the holder is the person who's signing the contract and who's making the decisions. So the beneficiary can be the holder, but they can also be, the holder can also be someone different from the holder, from the beneficiary rather. To be an eligible beneficiary, the beneficiary has to be resident of Canada. They have to be turning 59 or younger in the year that the RDSP is established and at the time of any particular contributions. If you want to get grants and bonds, you have to be turning 49 or younger. But the plan itself can actually continue well beyond age 49 until the death of the beneficiary at age 105. Whatever they happen to be, they can continue with the plan, but they have to set it up before they turn the end of the year they turn 59, and that's the last time you can make any contributions. The RDSP beneficiary has to have a valid social insurance number, and as discussed, they can have only one plan at a time. And then a key criteria to be an RDSP beneficiary is that they have to be approved for the federal disability tax credit. It used to be under the old rules that if you established an RDSP but then lost your DTC status, that the plan would have to close. But they changed those rules quite recently, or at least they proposed to change the rules. They haven't actually finalized the change, but I expect that anytime soon. But under the new rules, and certainly the government is allowing us to act as if the new rules in place right now. And under the new rules, even if you lose the DTC, you can continue to maintain your RDSP so long as you don't make any new contributions to it. So who can be the holder of an RDSP will depend on the age of the beneficiary when the RDSP is established. So if the beneficiary is still a minor at the time that you establish the RDSP, then the eligible holders are a legal parent or both of the beneficiary, or someone who's legally authorized to act for the beneficiary. So that typically means, for example, maybe the beneficiary is a ward of the estate, and so Child and Family Services could be authorized to act for them. But typically you're talking about the parents, and the parents could be co-holders if that's desired. If, on the other hand, you establish the RDSP when the beneficiary is an adult, then if the beneficiary is mentally capable of managing property, they must be the sole holder. On the other hand, if they're incapable and there's someone legally authorized to act for them, that person who's legally authorized to act can be the holder. And so that typically involves getting a court order declaring the person, the disabled individual, to be incapable and appointing someone to act on their behalf. But that step of going to court to get an order is rather cumbersome, and so there is a qualifying family member rule that says if the beneficiary is an adult, but a qualifying family member can provide reasonable grounds to doubt that beneficiary's capacity, then the qualifying family member can be the holder. So what's a qualifying family member? That means one or more of the beneficiary's current cohabiting spouse or common law partner, if any such person even exists, and or their legal parents, so mom and dad. The qualifying family member rule technically is set to expire at the end of 2023, but it's been set to expire several times before now, and they keep extending it. My guess is they probably will permanently extend it at one point in time, but for now it's a temporary provision, meaning that if possible, I would recommend that you set up the RDSP for your child while they're still a minor, so you don't need to worry about this rule. So grants and bonds. The federal government will kick in grants if you make an eligible contribution to an RDSP, and bond if you establish an RDSP and the family income is sufficiently low. How much grant and bond you're going to get in a particular year will depend on what your family income is for that particular year. So how much grant room are you going to generate in a year? If your income is high, then it's going to be 100% of the first $1,000 of contributions. So you contribute 1,000, you'll get 1,000. If your family income is not high, so it's low or middle, meaning roughly less than 97,000 or 100,000 thereabouts, then the grant room you generate in a particular year will be 300% of the first $500 of contributions and 200% of the next 1,000. So you put in 1,500, you get 3,500. And these thresholds change every year. So, but that's sort of the general gist of how the grant room works. That's how much room you generate in a particular year, but we'll talk about how the carry forward rules as well later. How much bond room do you generate in a year? And again, this is reserved for lower income families. So if your family income is roughly 30,000 or less, then you're looking at the full entitlement, which is 1,000 a year. If your family income is roughly 50,000 or more, then you're not going to get the bond. And if you're somewhere in between, then you'll get a prorated amount that's somewhere in between. That's how much bond you get. So again, we've been talking all this time saying, well, that it all depends on what your family income. So what does family income mean, and whose income are we looking at? For a beneficiary who's turning 18 or younger in the year, family income means the income of the beneficiary's primary caregiver and the beneficiary's primary caregiver's current cohabiting spouse or common law partner. So mom and dad, for the most part. Or if you're dealing with a single parent, it means the parent's income. Or possibly you're dealing with a parent who's divorced and now is in a new relationship. So it's the parent plus the step-parent, the cohabiting step-parent. If the beneficiary is turning 19 or older in the year, then you switch from looking at the parent's income to the beneficiary's income. So it's the beneficiary's income and the beneficiary's current cohabiting spouse or partner, if there is such a person. So again, for the typical 19-year-old, they're usually single, so you're just looking at the beneficiary's income. But you might be looking at a person with disabilities who's in their 50s and they're married and they have kids. They're going to look at their combined income of the beneficiary and their spouse. And you always look back 2 years, because why not? We just make things a little more complicated for you. And this is one of the quirks. So again, let's say I'm setting up an RDSP in early 2020. So it's January 2020. Not only will I not have filed the 2020 return yet, because 2020 isn't even over, so I haven't been able to report my 2020 income, I also haven't filed my 2019 tax return yet. So the CRA doesn't know what my income is for 2019 or 2020. The most recent return that they should have on file for me is 2018. So 2020 entitlements are going to be based on 2018 income. 2021 entitlements will be based on 2019 income, and so on. So you're always looking back 2 years. So as an example, if the beneficiary is turning 15 in 2020, then you're in that category of beneficiary turning less than or equal to 18. So that means you're looking at the parent's income. So you're going to look to the parent's income from 2018 to determine what the 2020 entitlement is. The good thing about grant and bond room is just like the disability tax credit itself, which we already mentioned, you can retroactively pick up. Grant and bond room can accumulate and will carry forward for up to 10 years. So RDSPs began in 2008. We're now into 2020, so there's going to be some people who maybe have been eligible for the credit and RDSPs since 2008. Well, they can't pick up the grants and bond entitlements that they would have generated in 2008 and 9, but they can pick up the grant and bond entitlements from 2010 forward if they establish the plan today and picked up grant, because you can catch up. It takes time to catch up. You won't necessarily fully catch up on all your grant and bond entitlements all at once, because there are lifetime and annual limits, and we'll talk about those now. So how much can be contributed to an RDSP? Well, there are no annual limits for private contributions, but there is a lifetime limit of $200,000. In terms of grants, the most you can pick up in a year is $10,500. So if we go back a few screens here to grant and bond, grant room generating. So you'll see that in the first, in a particular year, you could have generated up to $3,500 of grant room. So 3 years, if you're in that low to middle income situation, 3 years of grant room would be $10,500. So you could conceivably pick up 3 years worth of grant room all at once in 1 year, but no more than that. So if you're picking up grant from prior years, you wouldn't necessarily want to contribute a whole bunch of money, because you just want to pick up, contribute enough to pick up that maximum grant. Likewise with bond, the most you can pick up in a bond is $11,000. And that's pretty simple. For bond, all you need to do is just make sure you filed all your tax returns for the relevant years, so they have the income to test, establish the RDSP, and then once they've confirmed that you were eligible for the DTC and that you were in sufficiently low income, they'll just give you a catch-up check right away into the RDSP. The grant, though, requires a contribution to receive. So the good thing is the government will send you an annual letter after the first year in which you set up the RDSP. So if you set up an RDSP in 2020, then starting in 2021 and every future year, they'll send you a letter that looks like this. And it will say, if you want to max out your possible grant entitlements this year, then you should contribute this amount. And so that's what your decision would be. Do I contribute that amount, or do I contribute something lesser than that? Do you want to contribute more than that amount? Probably not, but maybe. It's going to depend on your situation. That's where you talk about that with your financial advisor. In any event, every year after that, no matter how much you contributed, they will do the calculations again, do the math the following year, saying, okay, now your room is this much. This is how much you should contribute if you want to max out your grant. So they make it, they do the math for you, so you don't have to, which is very helpful, because frankly, the math is kind of insane. It's pretty complicated. How are RDSPs taxed? Well, you don't get a deduction for your contributions. So that's what would happen if you're making a contribution to your RRSP. So you don't get that on an RDSP, but the grants and bonds that are received within the RDSP are not considered taxable income. And the plan itself will grow on a tax-deferred basis. So if the investments within it generate interest, capital gains, dividends, or whatever, that's not going to be taxed. So that's very similar to how a Registered Education Savings Plan, or RESP, would be taxed. When it comes to withdrawals, every withdrawal is going to be considered, there's a formula that says, okay, this much of that withdrawal is considered normal contributions versus rollover contributions versus grant versus income versus bond. And the portion that is considered normal contributions will be tax-free, and the rest of the payment, the withdrawal, will be taxable to the beneficiary. So that's, again, similar to RESPs, but not identical. How do withdrawals work? Well, you have to start making withdrawals in the year you turn 60, but you could make withdrawals anytime you wanted to, subject to clawback and tax. They distinguish between periodic withdrawals and lump sum withdrawals, and once you start periodic withdrawals, you cannot stop them. So you'll be committed to having to withdraw that same stream all the time. Because you can't stop them, I would suggest you should not start periodic withdrawals until you're required to start periodic withdrawals, which is at age 60. If you want to make withdrawals prior to age 60, you should just do them as lump sum withdrawals, just giving you more flexibility. Now, the key here, though, is that a withdrawal will trigger a clawback of up to a maximum of all the grants and bonds that had been received by the RDSP in the prior 10 years. This means that if you start withdrawals at age 60, you will never have a clawback. And that's because grants and bonds stop being paid to the RDSP after the end of the year in which you turn 49. So between 50 and 59, you're never going to get any grants and bonds. And so therefore at age 60, you go looking back 10 years, you say, well, there's nothing been picked up as grant and bond. There's going to be no clawback. If you're making withdrawals before age 60, you may have a clawback. So that's something to always consider when you're deciding if and when to make a withdrawal. So there are maximum withdrawal limits depending on who contributed more to the plan. If the government contributed more to the plan than you did, then the typical limit is 10% of the plan value. If you contributed at least as much as the government did, then there are no maximum withdrawal limits, but you still have to respect the clawback rule. So the design of RDSPs is that they're not for education savings, they're not for short term, they are for long term. It's not that you can't withdraw before age 60, it's just that you get the best bang for your buck if you wait until age 60. Now again, there are some exceptions and you can work around and plan for them, but as a general rule, when you're thinking RDSPs, I want you to think long-term savings because that's how they're designed. And that's it. Oh, and again, talk to your financial advisor if you have specific questions because these rules are very complicated and I've just given the highlights. If you don't have a financial advisor, IG Wealth Management would be happy to assist you, and you can go to investorsgroup.com and click on Find an Advisor to find an IG Wealth Management consultant in your area. And that's it for my part of the session, and now I think we're going to open it up to Q&A. Christine?
Perfect. Thank you very much. And we do have a few questions here. So one of the first questions I wanted to ask was, Sarah, you had mentioned at the beginning of your presentation, the what if you lose the DTC? What do you mean by that? How can you lose the disability tax credit?
Well, as we've been discussing before, sometimes when you're approved, the CRA can ask you to recertify at any time, right? Like the credit is approved. When you get the approval, sometimes the letter says you're approved indefinitely. Sometimes the letter says you're approved going back retroactively to such and such a year and going forward to such, to maybe 2025. Or maybe it just says you're approved for this year, whatever. If it gives a time limit, then you have to recertify at the time that the letter said, because otherwise they're just not going to give you the credit anymore. And as soon as that means you've lost the credit. But if you didn't, that's if you didn't recertify. If you do recertify and they approve it, then you can continue on. Sometimes they'll just randomly, by way of a desk audit, select people who are currently claiming the disability tax credit and approve for it, and they'll just say, hey, we're just randomly selecting you. Please recertify, prove to us once again that you are eligible for the credit. And again, sometimes that's just a make work project, and you just have to, go to your medical practitioner, fill out the form again, recertify. The CRA says fine, you're still disabled. We're going to give you the credit. But sometimes maybe your condition has improved and you no longer meet the necessary criteria. And if you go through the process and you've reapplied, they've denied it, maybe you've tried to object and you've gone through the appeal process, or you've given up, one or the other, then at that point you stop getting the credit. And when you stop getting the credit, the CRA will eventually notify the financial advisor and the financial institution rather, and then all sorts of other rules kick in. And again, originally the rules was that the plan would have to be wound up, but now it can continue. You just can't make new contributions to it.
Right. Thank you. And for Cynthia, I know we've spoken about this quite a bit, but I have a question here, and I don't know whether you can answer it or not, but how successful are applications for people with dyslexia or ADHD?
Yeah, I think it's really difficult to answer that question. I think that unfortunately we see that applications with mental functioning still have the highest rejection rate, and that's for a number of reasons. You know, mental health conditions or conditions with mental functioning are still sort of stigmatized, still gray. It's not as clear cut for the CRA to decide who's eligible. And then it's also sort of like different misunderstandings in different groups. So within medical professional fields and things like that, there's so many misconceptions about the form itself. But I will say this, you know, I think that what's really important is to think about, instead of how successful are, you know, applications for people with dyslexia, you really want to think about how severe someone's restrictions in functioning are. And so that's despite any, you know, diagnosis or anything at all. You want to think about, you know, like where someone needs help or where they require longer time or things like that to perform basic activities. And that's where we see that people are still qualifying. And I will say that, you know, we've seen successful applicants with people who have ADHD or functioning, people with levels of functioning that are, you know, higher or lower. It just depends on what the restrictions are and how restricted you are.
Okay, thank you. And another question for you, Cynthia. When you mentioned not including academics in the application, does that also include things like needing a scribe for writing notes or someone to read notes to you? So can you talk a little bit about that?
What a great question. I think that that's really important, because you definitely want to distinguish between academic skills and functioning that would have an impact on your daily life. So needing a scribe, needing someone to assist you while reading, that does happen in your daily life. You know, you can think of how that might impact your ability to you know, fill out important forms. You can think about how that might impact your ability to, you know, engage with the world outside of school. So instead of saying things like, oh, you know, my child is 3 levels behind, 3 grade levels behind, leave that wording aside and think about the restriction itself. So restrictions in reading are still pertinent, but what about that restriction, you know, how does that come to play, and how does that really impact their life?
Okay, thank you. And again, another question, Cynthia. And I've had this one actually multiple times. So I'll read you this question. That you discussed the time that it takes for someone with a marked restriction versus a significant restriction to complete tasks. How do you find out how long it would take your average child or neurotypical child to do an everyday task? How do you know that your child takes 3 times longer to get dressed in the morning than another child?
Yeah, that's such a good question. And it's especially challenging, I think, with children, right? Because there's a distinction that needs to be made between, you know, it takes them a long time because they're a child, you know, and you know, it takes them a long time in comparison to other peers. So I would think about, you know, taking some time and almost assessing, you know, your child with other peers of the same age. So let's say, you know, getting dressed. You know, why does it take them a long time to get dressed? Is it because lack of concentration? Are they needing, you know, constant reminders, instructions, support, supervision? And even with this is the reason why they're taking a long time. You know, maybe sort of like, you know, maybe not that they're distracted, but it's difficult for them to to follow verbal instructions or to follow written instructions, it takes them a long time to decipher these things. That's when you might want to take a step back and kind of think, okay, it seems like this is taking them a really long time. And that's when I would say 3 times. And for some things that you're like, okay, this is taking a little bit longer, that's when I would say 2 times. And it's unfortunate that the CRA requires such weird measurements. But those are sort of the things that I would use to gauge.
And I would add to that this is where you would want to have those discussions with the medical professional. They'll be able to help you gauge as well whether your child is taking 3 times longer or not. So I think all of these examples, it's great to have that ready and prepped to bring to your appointment, so you're not scrambling and having to think about it on the spot. So really take some time and list everything down that you are finding is impacted by the dyslexia or learning disability itself. Perfect. And then I have another question, Sarah, for you. The question is around speaking with an advisor. So at what point should you go speak to an advisor? Should you be doing that before you even put together your RDSP application, or is it just once you know if you're successful or not?
Well, as a general rule, I would say, firstly, I wouldn't attempt to establish an RDSP until you've been approved for the credit, because the plan can't be properly registered and won't properly, and will just basically sit in limbo until the credit has been verified and approved. It's a lot easier to establish the RDSP if you're already approved for the credit. So that's the first thing when establishing. But I would also talk to a financial advisor about whether establishing the RDSP is suitable for you and your family. If again, as I said, the design of the RDSP is for the long term. And if you are sort of torn between, oh, do I save this for now or for the future? And how future am I getting into with this money that I want to save? Like, do I want to use this for this person's education in 2 or 3 or 10 years? It's probably not suitable to put it into an RDSP. You might want to consider an RESP or even just non-registered savings if you're not intending post-secondary education. So there's that sort of, do I have the money to target for this for long term? And again, as the plan is ticking along, certainly anytime you're planning to make a withdrawal, talk to your advisor beforehand to make sure you know what the consequences of that withdrawal will be in terms of clawbacks, in terms of tax, so you're not surprised because the clawbacks can be quite significant depending on the timing of the withdrawal relative to when the grants and bonds came in. So again, that's where you're going to be looking at an ongoing relationship with a financial advisor, I think, if you're using an RDSP.
And that's such a good thing to say, Sarah. And I want to add, yeah, that's true for everyone who wants to open up an RDSP to make sure that's not the only thing that you're doing, that you have sort of a diverse portfolio and you're thinking about investments in different areas, or you're thinking about emergency funds and things like that. Yeah, I will say though that, it might not hurt if you just open one, and if let's say you're still eligible for bonds, like I think that's a nice thing to just have sit there. And for anybody who does live in BC, the Vancouver Foundation actually offers an endowment 150, so sort of $150 for any child or any adult who is very low income. And so that's just $150 in your account that you can just keep, and you don't have to contribute anything else if you'd like to take advantage of that.
Yeah, there are other factors to consider as well. Like if the person with disabilities is on social assistance, then RDSPs can be a very valuable savings tool, because most of the time for social assistance benefits, there are asset limits and income limits, but most provinces and territories will either fully or partially exempt RDSPs from those asset and income tests. So that can be very handy. But again, for the most part, if you're talking about brand new money, do I contribute to an RDSP for my kid or myself or not? I would say if it's long-term, super long term, it's a good idea. If it's a short term money, think twice. It's not necessarily unsuitable, but it might be unsuitable.
Perfect. Well, I see we have reached our time. It's now 3 o'clock. So I want to thank both Sarah and Cynthia for joining us today. I think that was a lot of really great information, very helpful. And I know you've answered a lot of the questions that we receive at Dyslexia Canada all the time. So thank you very much for taking the time out of your schedules to join us today and provide this information. And I want to just let everyone know as well on the line that not only will we be putting this presentation up on our website, but we'll also put the PowerPoint slides there as well, so you don't have to worry about madly trying to write anything down or scribe anything down. So we will provide both of those things on our website. And finally, I would just once again reiterate that if you want to find out any more information about the disability tax credit, you can go, there are some links on the PowerPoint presentation to both IG and to the Disability Alliance BC, so you can find out more information there. And for information about dyslexia generally, or to just have other questions answered about dyslexia, feel free to reach out to Dyslexia Canada at info@dyslexiacanada.org. And I would also highly recommend that while you're on our website that you sign up and subscribe to our newsletter. So once again, thank you very much to everyone across Canada for attending today. Thank you, Cynthia and Sarah. And
Thank you.
I hope everyone has a wonderful rest of their day.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Goodbye.